80-year-old Evelyn Carter was marched into a Georgia courthouse in handcuffs, accused of leading an armed attack on the mayor's building. But Willow Ridge knew her as a gardener, a church volunteer, a woman who once fought quietly for civil rights. When a corrupt mayor oppressed the poor and targeted black families, Evelyn organized evidence, not violence. The gunfire that night was staged to silence her. A judge demanded truth. The mayor fell. Evelyn walked free. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. The morning in Willow Ridge, Georgia felt sharper than usual. Cold air biting through coats, sunlight still spilling across the courthouse road where dry oak leaves scraped and swirled like restless whispers. For a town this small, the county courthouse was the closest thing to a stage, and today, everyone had come to watch the same unbelievable scene. A crowd gathered tight at the steps, shoulders pressed together, faces half curious, half afraid. They weren't here because of the weather. They were here because of the rumor moving faster than any wind. An 80-year-old black woman had been arrested as the mastermind behind the shooting at the mayor's building. 2 police officers appeared at the edge of the crowd first, so tall and broad that they seemed to bring their own shadow with them. Officer Daniel Brooks stepped forward on the left. He was a white man in his mid-30s, tall and broad-shouldered with fair skin and a light stubble beard that made his jaw look permanently clenched. His sandy brown hair was trimmed close, his pale blue eyes fixed straight ahead. Daniel's posture was rigid in the way of someone who'd learned to hide emotion behind rules. He wasn't cruel by nature. He was the kind of man who believed the uniform made him right, even when the situation felt wrong. On the right was Officer Travis Harlan, older, heavier in presence with a square neck, thick forearms, and a buzz cut that made him look like he'd been carved from the same stone as the courthouse steps. Travis was also white, early 40s, with a face that stayed hard even when he wasn't speaking. He had the quiet confidence of someone who'd been praised for keeping order for too long. Between them walked a woman who looked like she could have been their grandmother, Evelyn Carter. She was 80 years old, black. Small-framed, but not fragile. Thin in a way that came from decades of work, not weakness. Her skin was a deep brown, with fine age lines that traced the corners of her eyes like careful handwriting. Her silver hair had been pulled into a neat bun, not for beauty, but for discipline, the kind of habit you keep when you've survived too many years of being judged by appearances. Evelyn wore a worn wool coat that had once been charcoal, but had faded over time. Her hands were cuffed behind her back, the metal biting into her wrists. The cuffs looked too new against her skin, cold and modern against something old and human. She walked slowly, but her back stayed straight. No begging, no tears, no shaking. Just a steady gaze aimed toward the courthouse doors. A man in the crowd leaned in to whisper to another, his breath visible in the cold air. "That's her," he said. "They say she led it. The shooting. The mayor's building." The words hit the crowd like a thrown rock. People shifted uncomfortably, some nodding like they understood the world, others frowning like they didn't recognize it anymore. Because everyone in Willow Ridge knew Evelyn Carter. They knew her as the woman who grew collard greens and tomatoes in a little backyard garden on Cedar Street. They knew her as the one who brought cornbread to church dinners. They knew her as the old lady whose yellow dog used to follow her down the sidewalk like a shadow with a wagging tail. And now, the same town was watching her being walked like a criminal. A few feet away, hidden behind taller bodies and winter scarves, stood Lena Price. Lena was 19. Black, slim, and slightly hunched as if she'd trained herself to take up less space. Her skin was a warm brown, her face youthful but tightened by stress. She had dark eyes that never stopped scanning. Her hair was tucked beneath a knit cap, but loose strands still escaped at her temples. Lena wasn't dressed for attention. She wore a plain jacket and jeans, the kind of clothes you could disappear in. But what made her stand out wasn't her clothing. It was the way her fingers trembled around a small notebook pressed against her ribs, hidden under the jacket like a secret. Lena's personality had been shaped by one event she still couldn't name out loud without her stomach turning. The months she spent working inside the mayor's home. Months that taught her how fast a smile could become a threat, how please could turn into or else, and how easily powerful men made suffering look normal. Her fear wasn't vague. It was trained. She stared at Evelyn's handcuffs like they were a warning meant for her, too. Across the steps, near the edge of the courthouse lawn, a younger man adjusted his camera strap and checked his phone for signal. Noah Bennett. Noah was 26, white, lean, and slightly tall, more wiry than athletic. He had a narrow face, light brown hair that never stayed perfectly combed, and eyes that looked tired in a way that wasn't from lack of sleep, but from knowing too much too early. He wore a cheap winter jacket and carried a small camera that had seen better days. Noah wasn't from Willow Ridge originally. He'd come back after college because he'd grown up nearby, and because big city journalism had taught him a lesson he couldn't swallow. Sometimes the biggest stories weren't in the biggest places. They were buried in small towns where nobody thought anyone was watching. And this morning, Noah felt the story crawling across his skin like electricity. He didn't believe Evelyn Carter could be what they said she was, not because she was old, not because she was black, because the accusation felt staged, too dramatic, too convenient, too clean. Noah's phone buzzed once. A new message. No number attached. Just a file notification. He opened it. A USB icon labeled with 2 words in bold text, "Don't believe the charge." His throat tightened. He looked up from his phone and back at Evelyn, just as she reached the courthouse steps. The crowd parted instinctively, like people didn't want the accusation to touch them. Officer Harlan guided Evelyn's elbow with a firm grip. Not brutal, but unmistakably controlling. Evelyn didn't flinch. Officer Brooks kept his eyes forward, jaw working slightly like he was chewing on something he didn't want to taste. At the top of the steps, the courthouse doors opened. And there, framed by pale stone columns and the harsh geometry of law, stood Judge Harold Whitman. Judge Whitman was in his early 60s, white, tall, but slightly stooped at the shoulders, like the years of reading other people's disasters had physically weighed him down. His hair was silver gray, neatly parted. His eyes were blue-gray, sharp, observant, and not easily impressed. He wore his black robe like armor, but his face was not emotionless. It was controlled. Whitman had a reputation in the county. He was strict, but not reckless. He believed in procedure, but he didn't worship it. Years ago, a case involving a wrongly accused teenager had changed him. The boy had been convicted on weak evidence and later exonerated. Whitman had signed the earlier order that allowed the conviction to proceed. He never forgot that signature. It made him cautious in the only way that mattered. Cautious with certainty. Now he held a folder in his hands, looking down at the paper, then up at Evelyn. His gaze lingered longer than normal. Not pity, not judgment. Something closer to suspicion, like he was thinking, if this is true, the world has lost its mind. And if it's false, the world is doing something worse. Evelyn stopped at the threshold, the cold air lifting the edge of her coat. For the first time, her eyes moved. Not to the crowd, not to the officers, but to the judge. She didn't speak, but the look she gave him was steady enough to feel like a sentence. Look closer. Noah felt his chest tighten as he slipped the USB into his pocket. He could almost hear the town's silence becoming an object. Heavy, dangerous, and ready to fall on whoever tried to break it. Behind him, Lena clutched her notebook harder. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The courthouse doors waited like a mouth, and Willow Ridge held its breath as Evelyn Carter crossed the line between citizen and accused. Judge Whitman watched her enter, and as the officers led her in, he lowered his eyes back to the file. then paused, like something on the page had finally disturbed him. He murmured, too quietly for most people to hear, "Something is wrong at the beginning of this?" The doors closed behind them, and outside, the crowd remained, frozen not just by the cold, but by the terrifying possibility that the truth might be far uglier than the accusation. Decades before Handcuffs and courthouse whispers, Willow Ridge had been a softer town. The sidewalks were cracked but friendly, the church bells loud enough to echo across open fields, and people still believed that if you stood up at a town meeting and spoke clearly enough, something might change. Back then, Evelyn Carter was not an old woman in a faded coat. She was 22, sharp-eyed, quick on her feet, and impossible to ignore. Young Evelyn was tall for her time, slender but strong from hauling feed sacks and stacking library boxes. Her skin carried the same deep brown glow it would hold in old age, but then it was smooth and radiant under the Georgia sun. Her hair was thick and natural, worn in a rounded halo she refused to straighten despite neighbors suggesting it might make her more acceptable. She had a laugh that could slice through tension, bright and ringing like church bells after rain. But what defined her most wasn't beauty or volume. It was clarity. When she spoke, she did not ramble. She built arguments the way some people built fences, measured, deliberate, leaving no gaps. She began attending town meetings at 19. At first, she sat in the back row beside her mother, Clara Williams, a quiet seamstress with narrow shoulders and patient eyes. Clara had raised Evelyn alone after her husband died in a mill accident, and hardship had shaped her into a woman who believed survival depended on staying unnoticed. Clara's hands were always busy, mending, sewing, folding, but her voice stayed low. She loved her daughter fiercely, but she worried that Evelyn's refusal to stay silent would cost her something one day. The first time Evelyn stood up during a meeting, it was about the road on Magnolia Street. After heavy rain, it turned to mud so thick children lost their shoes walking home from school. The town council dismissed it as budget constraints. Evelyn didn't shout. She simply listed the tax numbers, the repair allocations, and the visible inequality between Magnolia Street and the paved roads near wealthier white neighborhoods. She spoke calmly, almost academically, but when she finished, the room felt different. Silence had become uncomfortable. That was Evelyn's gift. She didn't inflame crowds. She illuminated them. Over the next few years, she organized book drives for the underfunded elementary school. She convinced local farmers to donate produce for families struggling during drought seasons. When reports of discriminatory policing began surfacing, young black men stopped without cause, searched without explanation. Evelyn gathered testimony, not rumors. She believed in documentation long before she would teach others to do the same. It was at a modest fundraiser for the town's tiny public library that she met Henry Carter. Henry was 26 then, a black carpenter with broad hands and steady posture. He was tall, solidly built from years of lifting lumber, his skin a rich mahogany shade that darkened in summer. His face was rectangular, his expression thoughtful rather than expressive. He did not smile easily, but when he did, it was genuine and unguarded. Henry had lost his father young as well, and responsibility had shaped him early. He spoke slowly, choosing words carefully as if each one had to justify its existence. Unlike Evelyn, Henry disliked crowds. He preferred wood to people. Wood made sense. It bent predictably, cracked for reasons you could understand. People were less reliable. At the fundraiser, while Evelyn coordinated donation tables and rearranged chairs with relentless efficiency, Henry was repairing a broken bookshelf in the corner. Their first conversation wasn't romantic. It was practical. "You tightened that hinge wrong," she told him without hesitation. Henry looked up, surprised at her boldness. "Then show me how you do it." She did. He watched carefully. They married 2 years later in a small church with peeling white paint and folding chairs borrowed from neighbors. There was no extravagant reception, no diamond ring large enough to impress anyone. What they had instead was shared conviction. They believed peace was not passive. Peace required maintenance, like a house, like a fence, like a garden. They built their home themselves on Cedar Street, modest, single-story with a porch Henry crafted by hand. Henry measured every beam twice. Evelyn planted tomatoes before the drywall was finished. The house became a symbol not of wealth, but of stability. Years passed. Movements rose and fell. National headlines changed. But in Willow Ridge, Evelyn remained a steady presence. She served on advisory committees, advocated for fair housing, mentored younger women who were afraid to speak publicly. She aged gradually, not dramatically. Gray strands appeared, laugh lines deepened. Then came Buddy. Buddy was a golden retriever mix, adopted from a nearby shelter when he was barely 8 months old. His fur was thick and slightly uneven, one ear flopping more than the other. He grew into a large, gentle dog with patient brown eyes and a slow, sweeping tail wag. Buddy had been abandoned once, found tied near a gas station, and that early betrayal made him cling fiercely to affection. He followed Evelyn everywhere, from garden rows to porch steps. In old age, he developed stiffness in his hips, but his loyalty never slowed. By the time Evelyn turned 75, she and Henry had settled into predictable rhythms. Morning coffee on the porch, watering plants, occasional church services. Henry's hands, once powerful with tools, began to tremble slightly from arthritis. Evelyn's voice softened but did not disappear. They wanted nothing more than quiet. But history, as Evelyn often said, had a habit of circling back. Back in the present timeline while Evelyn sat in a holding room inside the courthouse after her arrest. Noah Bennett inserted the mysterious USB into an aging desktop computer at the small newsroom office downtown. The newsroom belonged to the Willow Ridge Ledger, a struggling local paper run by Margaret Doyle, a 58-year-old editor with sharp cheekbones, cropped iron-gray hair, and a permanent crease between her brows. Margaret had once worked in Atlanta covering larger political scandals before returning to care for her ailing mother. The city had hardened her instincts. She trusted evidence more than appearances. The computer hummed loudly, its outdated monitor flickering as encrypted folders appeared on screen. Noah leaned forward, pale light reflecting in his tired eyes. One file opened partially. A blurred security clip showing a person in what appeared to be a municipal jacket unloading large crates behind the mayor's building, time-stamped days before the shooting. Margaret stepped behind him, folding her arms. "You're thinking what I'm thinking," she said quietly. "That the narrative's too clean," Noah replied. Margaret nodded once. "Clean stories are usually dirty underneath." Across town, Lena Price sat alone in her small bedroom, walls painted a faded lavender from childhood. She was staring at her notebook, the same one pressed against her ribs at the courthouse. Lena had started writing in it months ago after an incident inside the mayor's estate unsettled her deeply. The mayor's housekeeper, Mrs. Evelyn Moore, a thin white woman in her late 60s with pale skin and perpetually anxious eyes, once pulled Lena aside and whispered, "Some things are best forgotten." Mrs. Moore herself had survived decades by keeping her head down, but Lena could not. That warning had planted the opposite seed in her. Instead of forgetting, she began documenting everything. The crates in Noah's video clip bore a faint marking Lena recognized immediately. She'd seen similar symbols stamped on storage boxes in the estate's back garage. She flipped through her notebook, fingers trembling less now, and found the page where she had sketched that exact marking. She stared at it for a long time. Young Evelyn had believed in records, in documentation, in standing up not with fist but with facts. Lena closed her notebook and inhaled slowly. She would not forget. Back in the courthouse holding room, Evelyn sat alone on a wooden bench. The metal cuffs had been removed temporarily, but red marks remained on her wrists. She closed her eyes briefly, and perhaps for a moment she wasn't 80. She was 22 again, standing in a crowded room, speaking calmly about a muddy road no one wanted to fix. Peace, she had once believed, required maintenance. And somewhere deep inside, she understood that the story unfolding now had begun decades earlier, not with gunfire, but with small injustices people chose not to challenge. She opened her eyes again and waited. Derek Crowley won the mayoral election on a bright September evening, the kind of southern dusk that turns the sky peach and gold before surrendering to purple. People gathered in the town square, clapping politely, some enthusiastically, most cautiously hopeful. Willow Ridge had been economically stagnant for years. The factories had thinned out. Farms were selling land, and young people were leaving. Crowley stood on a temporary stage beneath a banner that read, "Renewal and Order." He looked every bit the promise of momentum. Derek Crowley was 38, white, tall, and sharply dressed in a navy suit that fit him with tailored precision. His blonde hair was styled carefully, not stiff but deliberate, and his smile was wide enough to appear sincere from a distance. His voice carried easily across crowds, measured, confident, polished by debate teams and private schools. He had studied political science at a respected university and returned to Willow Ridge claiming he wanted to give back. What many didn't see was the steel beneath his charm. Crowley did not tolerate contradiction. Even during debates, when questioned too aggressively, his jaw tightened in a way that hinted at impatience with dissent. Standing a few feet behind him that night was his campaign manager, Richard Hale, a thin, middle-aged white man with narrow shoulders and sharp cheekbones. Richard wore wire-framed glasses and carried himself like a man who preferred strategy over visibility. He had once worked in corporate consulting, known for restructuring failing companies by cutting costs ruthlessly. That mindset, efficiency over empathy, would soon influence the town's policies more than anyone realized. Evelyn and Henry had attended that rally, not because they believed in spectacle, but because they believed in civic responsibility. Henry stood slightly apart from the cheering crowd, arms folded across his chest, studying Crowley's tone more than his words. Evelyn listened carefully, head tilted, noticing what wasn't being said. Promises of order, repeated emphasis on compliance, subtle references to disciplined growth. She had lived long enough to recognize when language hid intention. Within months of Crowley taking office, change arrived swiftly. Property taxes increased by nearly 15%. The explanation cited infrastructure upgrades, yet Magnolia Street still flooded after rain. New processing fees appeared for small business permits. Vendors at the farmers' market, many of them black families selling produce from small plots, were suddenly required to purchase expensive compliance licenses. One of those vendors was Mrs. Clara Jennings, a short, round-shouldered black woman in her late 50s who had known Evelyn since childhood. Clara's hair was always wrapped in colorful scarves, and her laughter had once been as dependable as sunrise. But when the new fees hit, that laughter faded. Her husband had passed from heart complications years earlier, and her produce stand was her only income. When she fell behind on payments, city officials shut her booth down, temporarily pending review. Clara stopped attending church dinners after that. Humiliation changed her posture. She walked with her eyes down. Then came the Civic Improvement Labor Program. Crowley presented it as a volunteer initiative to beautify neglected areas of Willow Ridge. In practice, it disproportionately targeted young black men for mandatory participation after minor infractions like unpaid tickets. Those who resisted found themselves facing harsher fines or license suspensions. One of the first summoned was Malik Turner, 23, tall and lean with deep brown skin and tightly coiled hair cropped close to his scalp. Malik worked part-time at a hardware store and helped his mother with rent. He had a thoughtful demeanor, usually calm, but quick flashes of anger when confronted with injustice. As a teenager, he had once been stopped and searched walking home from basketball practice. The memory lingered like a bruise. Now he was ordered to clear brush on land later revealed to be part of a private development project tied to Crowley's associates. The labor sites were overseen by Deputy Carl Simmons, a heavy-set white man in his 40s with a sun-reddened neck and permanent scowl. Carl prided himself on discipline. He barked instructions without conversation and treated compliance as proof of virtue. Under his watch, the line between civic duty and forced labor blurred dangerously. Meanwhile, young women in town began receiving quiet invitations to work temporary domestic roles at the mayor's estate. The positions promised steady pay and flexible hours. In reality, the environment was unpredictable and intimidating. Lena Price had been one of those women months earlier. The estate itself was a large white house set back behind iron gates, manicured lawns hiding the unease inside. Inside the estate worked Vivian Crowley, the mayor's wife, a tall, pale woman in her early 30s with immaculate posture and perfectly styled auburn hair. Vivian had grown up in affluence and carried herself with refined detachment. She was not openly cruel, but she existed in comfortable denial. She rarely intervened when her husband's temper sharpened. Her passivity, shaped perhaps by a lifetime of privilege and expectation, made her complicit through silence. More troubling were the unspoken expectations placed on pregnant domestic workers. Humiliating, degrading demands disguised as personal requests. Rumors spread quietly among women, but fear of retaliation kept complaints private. One woman, Tessa Grant, barely 21 and 6 months pregnant, left her position abruptly and refused to discuss it publicly. She grew withdrawn, shoulders hunched protectively over her belly whenever Crowley's name surfaced. At the elementary school, funding shortfalls worsened. Principal Martha Ellis, a tall white woman in her early 50s with tired green eyes and streaks of gray in her brown hair, tried to shield students from the brunt of budget cuts. Martha had once been an optimistic educator, but years of political shifts had hardened her realism. When meal programs were reduced, she discreetly expanded the school pantry, using personal funds to buy canned goods. Yet even the church's free meal program faced unexpected inspections from city officials citing sanitation concerns. Fear began settling into Willow Ridge like humidity, thick, suffocating, hard to escape. Conversations lowered in volume. Attendance at town meetings declined. People avoided eye contact when discussing policy changes. Evelyn observed all of it, from her porch, from church pews, from grocery lines. She noticed how laughter shortened, how Malik stopped playing music while working in his yard, how Mrs. Jennings stopped setting aside extra tomatoes for neighbors. To Evelyn, it looked like a house catching fire from the inside while the occupants debated whether smoke was real. Back at the Ledger office, Noah Bennett dug deeper into the files from the USB. Margaret Doyle stood nearby, arms crossed, silent but alert. Financial spreadsheets revealed something unsettling. Allocations from the town's security enhancement budget had been routed into a company called Crowley Consulting. The business address led to a nondescript office suite outside Savannah. Public records tied its registration to Richard Hale. "That's not infrastructure," Noah muttered. Margaret leaned closer, eyes narrowing. "That's insulation," she said, "insulating power." They cross-referenced dates. Shortly after each budget transfer, new enforcement policies had been implemented. More patrols, stricter citations, expanded labor directives. Meanwhile, Lena received a phone call from the mayor's administrative office requesting her presence for clarification of employment documentation. The voice on the line belonged to Marjorie Kent, a middle-aged white woman with a clipped tone and immaculate diction. Marjorie was the mayor's administrative assistant, efficient, impeccably dressed, and emotionally neutral. She had built her career on loyalty and discretion, and she disliked unpredictability. When Lena arrived at the estate's side entrance, she was met instead by Earl Patterson, the elderly groundskeeper. Earl was 72, black, stooped from decades of yard work, his skin weathered by sun and time. His hands trembled slightly, but his eyes remained sharp. Earl had seen political tides rise and fall. He had survived by reading people carefully. "You don't want to go in there today," Earl murmured quietly, glancing toward the front drive where a black SUV idled. "They're not asking questions. They're fishing." Lena hesitated. Her heart pounded, but she trusted Earl's instinct. She left before entering the house, walking quickly down the road until she felt the gates no longer looming behind her. That was the moment she realized something deeper. She was being watched. A parked car across from her apartment lingered longer than necessary that evening. The driver never exited, just observed. The message was clear. Silence was safer, but safety was shrinking. Back on Cedar Street, Henry sat on the porch, sanding a piece of wood absent-mindedly, though there was nothing left to smooth. Arthritis had slowed his movements, but his mind remained steady. He watched Evelyn stand at the edge of their yard, looking toward town as if she could see the shifts invisible to others. "Feels different," Henry said quietly. Evelyn nodded. "It is." She did not shout warnings. She did not rally crowds. Not yet. She watched patterns forming, money moving, power tightening, fear spreading. To her, the town resembled a burning house where smoke seeped through cracks while neighbors argued whether raising an alarm would make things worse. The shadow of Derek Crowley had stretched long across Willow Ridge, and the town had begun learning how to live beneath it. By the time fear had settled into Willow Ridge like a second climate, Evelyn Carter understood something simple. She could no longer outrun injustice, but she could outthink it. Age had thinned her arms and slowed her steps, yet it had sharpened something else. Pattern recognition. She had lived through segregation, through broken promises dressed as reform, through systems that smiled while tightening their grip. Experience had made her cautious, but never passive. Her resistance did not begin with speeches. It began with cornbread. On a mild Sunday afternoon, Evelyn invited a few young men from church to her porch. The invitation was casual, almost grandmotherly. "I made too much," she said with a knowing smile, but her eyes missed nothing. Malik Turner came first, tall and serious, hands stuffed into his jacket pockets as though still bracing against authority. His posture had changed since the labor program began. His shoulders were heavier, his speech more measured. Behind him came Jonah Reed, 24, lighter-skinned with soft brown eyes and a quick grin that hid anxiety. Jonah had once dreamed of opening a mechanic shop, but unpaid fines now threatened his license. He masked fear with humor, but his knee bounced constantly when seated. They ate quietly at first, steam rising from enamel plates. Evelyn asked about work, about family, about schedules. She never interrogated. She listened. When Malik mentioned being assigned again to clear land near the eastern property line, she simply nodded and asked, "Did you notice which trucks came through? Any company markings?" The question seemed casual. It wasn't. A few days later, Evelyn asked Ray Collins to repair a loose fence post in her backyard. Ray was 27, broad-shouldered, with dark skin and careful movements. He had once served a short sentence for a minor offense exaggerated into something larger. That experience had quieted him. He trusted few people. As he tightened the screws, Evelyn offered lemonade and asked if he had seen city vehicles traveling at odd hours. Ray hesitated, then admitted he had noticed deliveries to a warehouse on nights when official records listed it as closed. Each conversation became a thread. Evelyn did not write notes openly. Instead, she memorized patterns and repeated them to Henry at night in low tones while Buddy slept at their feet. Buddy, now nearly 12 years old, had slowed considerably. His once bright coat had dulled slightly and arthritis made his hips stiff, but he still lifted his head whenever voices shifted in urgency, as if aware that his family's safety depended on listening. Gradually, a small circle formed. Malik, Jonah, Ray, and Tessa Grant. Tessa arrived one evening carrying a pie she hadn't baked. Her movements were protective, one hand unconsciously resting on her pregnant belly. Her once vibrant personality had dimmed since leaving the mayor's estate. She had been lively before, quick to laugh, fond of bright dresses. Now she wore muted colors and avoided eye contact when Crowley's name surfaced. Evelyn greeted her gently, never pressing for details she wasn't ready to share. They gathered around Evelyn's kitchen table under a dim overhead light. The house smelled faintly of soil and cedarwood, a reminder of Henry's craft and Evelyn's garden. There were no raised voices, no dramatic vows, only quiet strategy. "We do not react," Evelyn said softly. "We observe." Malik frowned. "Observe while they keep pushing?" "We gather truth," she replied. "Without proof, we are exactly what they want us to be." The group agreed on simple tasks. Track license plates of municipal trucks. Photograph unusual shipments. Save receipts from new compliance fees. Keep dates and times consistent. They were building a timeline, not a riot. Jonah suggested purchasing firearms just in case. Ray agreed cautiously. Evelyn did not forbid it, but she warned them clearly. If a single bullet comes from our side first, they win. She had seen history rewritten before. Violent reactions used to justify deeper oppression. Meanwhile, Noah Bennett and Margaret Doyle worked late at the ledger. The encrypted files from the USB continued revealing fragments. One folder, partially unlocked, contained a document titled Stability Measures, Phase 2. The language was clinical. Names appeared in a column labeled Influence Risk. Among them, Evelyn Carter. Noah leaned back in his chair, heart racing. They listed her months ago. Margaret adjusted her glasses, studying the screen. That means this isn't reactionary, it's premeditated. The document outlined surveillance priorities and containment strategies. Though no explicit violence was mentioned, the tone suggested preparation for disruption. Margaret's jaw tightened. She had seen similar memos during her years covering corporate scandals, language designed to distance accountability. Across town, Lena Price began organizing her notebook more systematically. She wrote dates at the top of each page now. Underneath, she listed names she overheard inside the estate. Richard Hale meeting privately with an unfamiliar man in a gray suit. Shipments delivered late at night. Vivian Crowley dismissing questions with brittle politeness. Lena also sketched the symbol she had seen stamped on certain crates. An angular insignia resembling a stylized C intersected by a diagonal line. Lena's fear remained, but something stronger had begun replacing it. Resolve. Her grandmother had once told her that surviving injustice without recording it allowed it to repeat. That memory anchored her. One evening, as Lena returned home, she noticed the same black sedan parked across from her apartment building again. The driver remained indistinct behind tinted glass. She walked past without looking directly at it. Inside her apartment, she locked the door and immediately wrote the time and license plate in her notebook. Back at the Carter house, the small circle expanded cautiously. Mrs. Clara Jennings returned quietly, having regained some of her composure. She brought surplus vegetables as an excuse to visit. Though not part of the active tracking, she shared what she overheard at city offices while appealing her permit suspension. She described overhearing Deputy Simmons mention escalation protocols. Evelyn listened carefully. Every piece mattered. The group eventually created a simple code. If something urgent occurred, they would leave a folded newspaper on Evelyn's porch bench. No texts, no emails, physical signals only. It was old-fashioned, but harder to intercept. Henry watched these meetings with concern but never interference. His hands trembled more now, but his voice remained steady. "You're building something," he told Evelyn one night. "I'm remembering something," she corrected gently. "How this works." Dear, outside, Willow Ridge continued operating under Crowley's tightening grip. Patrol presence increased. Inspection notices multiplied. Conversations shortened. But beneath the surface, a quiet countercurrent was forming. Evelyn knew the risk. She had already been listed as an influence risk. She suspected they would eventually come for her. But silence, she believed, would make that arrival inevitable anyway. The work continued. Photographs accumulated, dates aligned, patterns clarified, and though no one said it aloud, they all understood. This was not about overthrowing power with force. It was about confronting it with evidence strong enough to survive scrutiny. Evelyn had once been the girl who stood up about muddy roads. Now she was the old woman building a map of corruption, and she refused to let history be rewritten without resistance. The sky over Willow Ridge that night looked unnaturally heavy, as if a thick black cloth had been pulled tight across it. No moon, no stars. Even the air felt paused, holding something back. By 10 o'clock, most porch lights were off, but inside several homes, tension flickered brighter than any bulb. The plan had never been dramatic. It was never meant to be. Malik, Jonah, Ray, and Tessa had agreed to approach the municipal records warehouse on the eastern edge of town. A squat brick building with narrow windows and a rusting side entrance rarely used after hours. The goal was simple. Confirm the existence of documents tied to the forced labor program and financial transfers, not steal, not destroy, not vandalize, confirm. Evelyn had insisted on it. She did not go with them. Her body would not have kept pace in darkness, and more importantly, her presence would make them easier to target. She remained at home on Cedar Street, seated at her small wooden kitchen table. Henry sat across from her, silent, his hands folded. Buddy lying between them with his gray muzzled head resting on his paws. The old dog's breathing was slow but alert, ears twitching at distant sounds. "Remember," Evelyn had told the group before they left, her voice low but unwavering. "No confrontation. If anything feels wrong, you walk away. Evidence, not ego." Malik had nodded, jaw tight. Jonah forced a small grin to hide nerves. Ray checked his phone battery twice. Tessa, her pregnancy now visibly rounding her frame, stayed behind as well. Her role was to monitor police scanner chatter from home, her sharp ears trained on coded signals. The warehouse perimeter was dimly lit. A chain-link fence bordered the lot, though one section near the rear had long been bent outward from neglect. Malik moved first, tall silhouette blending with shadow. Jonah followed, heart pounding louder than he liked to admit. Ray hung back slightly, scanning for headlights. Inside, rows of filing cabinets and stacked archive boxes created narrow corridors. The smell of paper and dust filled the air. Jonah used his phone's flashlight sparingly, angling it low to avoid window reflection. Malik located a cabinet labeled Community Compliance. He took photos quickly, hands steady despite adrenaline. Outside, a car engine hummed faintly, too faint for them to register at first. Then it happened. A sharp crack tore through the night. Gunfire, but not from the warehouse. The sound came from the opposite direction, toward the mayor's office building downtown. Another shot followed, then two in quick succession. Malik froze. "That's not us," he whispered urgently. Red and blue lights began flashing in the distance almost immediately, too quickly, as if already positioned nearby. Sirens wailed, cutting through the silence with rehearsed precision. Within minutes, the town's emergency alert system buzzed phones across Willow Ridge. Active shooter reported at mayor's building, suspects at large. Malik's stomach dropped. "We're being set up." Ray grabbed his arm. "Move! Now!" They retreated through the fence gap and scattered, splitting directions as previously discussed in worst-case scenarios. No one ran toward downtown. They ran home. On Cedar Street, Evelyn heard the sirens and stood slowly. Henry rose with her. Buddy barked once, a deep, uneasy sound. Evelyn did not panic, but her hands tightened against the table edge. Tessa's voice came through Malik's phone minutes later, breathless. "Scanner says multiple units already stationed downtown before first report." That's not response. That's staging. By midnight, local television cut into regular programming. Channel 8 News, anchored by Diane Porter, a poised woman in her 40s with smooth dark hair and composed diction, announced that shots had been fired at the mayor's building. Diane's expression carried practiced gravity, but something in her tone felt scripted. Moments later, Derek Crowley appeared live outside the building. He wore a dark overcoat over his suit, his blonde hair slightly disheveled in what looked like manufactured distress. A faint smudge marked the shoulder of his jacket, almost too perfect for camera framing. "This," he declared solemnly, "is a terrorist act against stability. We have reason to believe extremist elements within our community are responsible. The leader of this group is Evelyn Carter." He did not hesitate when saying her name. The accusation moved through Willow Ridge faster than the sirens had. At the Ledger office, Noah Bennett watched the broadcast replay in stunned silence. Margaret Doyle stood beside him, arms crossed, eyes narrowing. "He was ready," she muttered. That statement wasn't spontaneous. As if on cue, Noah's phone rang. The number was blocked. He hesitated before answering. "This is Noah." A low, disguised voice spoke quickly. "If you want the truth, check traffic cam at intersection 7, 11:48 p.m. Don't trust the narrative." The call ended. Noah stared at the screen, pulse racing. Meanwhile, across town, Lena sat rigid on her bed, television volume low. The mention of Evelyn's name made her breath catch. She opened her notebook again, flipping to earlier sketches of crate markings. Her memory replayed something she had seen weeks ago, identical crates being unloaded into the municipal security supply room adjacent to the mayor's garage. The angular insignia, the diagonal slash through the letter C. She realized something chilling. The symbol was not random. It was the same marking on ammunition boxes she had once glimpsed when Richard Hale met privately with a uniformed man she didn't recognize. Lena stood and paced the room, heart pounding. If those crates had contained weapons later used in the staged shooting, then the narrative wasn't just false, it was engineered. By dawn, police vehicles lined Cedar Street. Officer Daniel Brooks approached the Carter home again, this time not as escort but as arresting officer. His posture remained rigid, but his eyes avoided direct contact. Behind him stood Deputy Carl Simmons, face hardened with satisfaction. Henry opened the door before they knocked twice. "We have a warrant," Simmons announced curtly. Evelyn stepped forward without argument. She had already put on her coat. "You are being charged with conspiracy and coordination of armed assault against municipal property," Brooks recited mechanically. Henry's jaw tightened, but he did not interfere. Buddy growled softly, standing with difficulty, placing himself between Evelyn and the officers until Henry gently restrained him. The metal cuffs clicked into place behind Evelyn's wrists. Cameras had arrived suspiciously fast. Channel 8's van parked across the street, Diane Porter's crew already setting up for footage. Evelyn walked out between Brooks and Simmons, back straight, chin lifted. She did not speak to reporters. She did not deny. She did not plead. She looked directly at the lens. Inside her expression was neither fear nor anger, only recognition. She understood what this was, a message. Across town, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Clara Jennings, who had once lowered her eyes, stood outside her closed produce stand and shook her head openly when neighbors repeated the accusation. Principal Martha Ellis refused to discipline a student for calling the arrest wrong. Even Earl Patterson at the mayor's estate turned off the television in disgust. The absurdity of the accusation began cracking the surface of fear, because people remembered who Evelyn Carter was, and because the timing, the perfection, felt wrong. By noon, social media buzzed with divided opinions. Some believed the mayor's statement unquestioningly. Others questioned how an 80-year-old grandmother orchestrated an armed assault while baking cornbread hours earlier. In quiet living rooms, in barbershops, in church kitchens, doubt spread. And doubt, once planted, was harder to control than obedience. Evelyn was transported back to the courthouse holding room where this story had begun. The trap had been sprung exactly as designed, but outside, something else had begun shifting. The silence that once protected power was no longer as solid as it had been. The preliminary hearing began under fluorescent lights that flattened every face in the courtroom. The benches were filled. Town residents, reporters, uniformed officers standing along the walls. Outside, the air remained tense, but inside, the atmosphere felt clinical, almost rehearsed. Evelyn Carter sat at the defense table in a standard-issue holding jacket. Her silver hair neatly pulled back as always. The cuffs had been removed for the hearing, but rested visibly on the table in front of her, as if placed there to remind everyone of their weight. Her posture remained upright. She did not whisper to anyone. She did not fidget. Across the aisle stood Prosecutor Alan Rhodes, a white man in his early 40s with narrow lips and sharply parted dark hair. Rhodes carried himself with polished certainty, the kind cultivated in competitive law schools and reinforced by consistent wins. His suits were always immaculate, his tie knotted tightly as if mirroring his personality. He believed in advancement, in reputation, in aligning himself with rising power. Derek Crowley's administration had quietly benefited his career. Rhodes read the charges in a steady voice, each word measured and deliberate. Conspiracy to incite armed assault against municipal property, coordination with extremist associates, intent to destabilize local government. He delivered them as if reading a verdict already decided. There was no tremor in his tone. But Judge Harold Whitman was not reading from the same script. Whitman leaned back slightly in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. His blue-gray eyes shifted between the prosecutor and Evelyn. He had reviewed the file twice the night before. It was thorough, too thorough. Timelines aligned with unnatural precision. Witness statements lacked inconsistency. The case had the symmetry of something engineered. He looked at Evelyn again. An 80-year-old woman, hands folded calmly, eyes steady, not defiant, not broken. "Mr. Rhodes," Whitman said slowly, "the efficiency of your file is impressive." A few murmurs rippled through the room. Whitman continued, voice even. "But sometimes efficiency hides haste." The prosecutor stiffened slightly. "Your Honor, the evidence speaks clearly." Whitman's gaze did not waver. Smoke often suggests fire, but occasionally, smoke is manufactured to conceal a different flame. The room fell silent. Whitman set the file down. "I am ordering a temporary suspension of preliminary judgment. I am requesting immediate involvement from the State Bureau of Investigation." Crowley, seated behind his legal counsel, shifted sharply. Derek Crowley looked less composed than he had during his televised address. His blond hair was perfectly styled again, but a tightness had crept into his jaw. He whispered urgently to his attorney. Whitman continued, voice firm. "All traffic and municipal surveillance footage within a half-mile radius of the mayor's building and eastern warehouse will be seized. Security budget allocations and labor contracts will undergo independent audit. This court will not proceed on assumption." A visible tension spread across the prosecutor's face. In the gallery, Margaret Doyle exhaled slowly. By late afternoon, agents from the Georgia State Bureau of Investigation arrived in Willow Ridge. Leading the team was Agent Rebecca Alvarez, a Latina woman in her mid-30s with sharp dark eyes and shoulder-length black hair pulled into a low ponytail. She carried herself with calm authority, her posture straight but not aggressive. Rebecca had built her career investigating public corruption cases across small southern municipalities. Her father had once been falsely accused in a zoning dispute, an experience that shaped her intolerance for procedural shortcuts. Rebecca reviewed initial reports without commentary. She requested raw footage, not edited clips. She asked for ballistic reports before media summaries. Her approach unsettled local authorities accustomed to deference. The first breakthrough came from the traffic camera at intersection 7. At precisely 11:48 p.m., footage showed a municipal security vehicle idling 2 blocks from the mayor's building, engine running before the first gunshot was reported. The timestamp contradicted official dispatch logs. Agent Alvarez watched the clip twice, expression unreadable. "Who authorized this positioning?" she asked. No immediate answer came. Ballistics reports followed. The bullets recovered from the mayor's building were of a caliber not registered to any weapon legally owned by Malik, Jonah, or Ray. In fact, they matched ammunition frequently issued to contracted municipal security units. Meanwhile, financial auditors traced security enhancement funds to Crowley Consulting, the same shell company Noah and Margaret had uncovered. Paperwork cited protective services expansion, but no actual service contracts existed. The most disturbing evidence surfaced in an internal audio file recovered from a backup server, an archived recording from a closed-door meeting weeks earlier. The voice, identified as Richard Hales, stated calmly, "We need an incident significant enough to justify full compliance measures, something decisive." The implication was unmistakable. Evelyn remained in custody during this unfolding review, but the nature of her confinement shifted subtly. Guards no longer treated her as volatile. Even Officer Brooks avoided prolonged eye contact. Something in his earlier certainty eroded. Outside the courthouse, public opinion began fracturing visibly. Noah Bennett published the first investigative article in the Willow Ridge Ledger. He did not reveal his source, but laid out inconsistencies. Traffic cam discrepancies, unexplained budget transfers, timeline conflicts. The headline read, "Questions surround official narrative." Margaret approved it without hesitation. The article spread quickly across social media platforms. Regional outlets picked it up. Pressure mounted on state officials to maintain transparency. Lena Price made a decision that terrified her. She requested a meeting with Agent Alvarez. They met in a small interview room at the county building. Lena's hands trembled slightly as she placed her notebook on the table. She described the crates, the symbol, the late-night deliveries, the private meetings. Her voice shook at first, but steadied as she continued. Rebecca Alvarez listened without interruption, occasionally jotting notes. "Why come forward now?" Rebecca asked gently. Lena swallowed. "Because silence is part of the plan." Agent Alvarez nodded once. The notebook was entered into evidence. Back inside the courtroom days later, Whitman reconvened the hearing. This time, the atmosphere felt less certain. Crowley's attorney attempted to argue political sabotage, but the mounting documentation weakened his tone. Prosecutor Rhodes appeared less confident, flipping through papers that no longer aligned seamlessly. Whitman addressed the room deliberately. The court acknowledges significant procedural inconsistencies. Until this investigation concludes, all charges against Mrs. Carter remain under review. Bail is granted pending final determination. A faint murmur rose, surprise mixed with restrained relief. Evelyn stood slowly as the decision registered. She did not smile. She did not gloat, but something in her eyes shifted, not triumph, but validation. The handcuffs were removed entirely. The sound of metal releasing from her wrists echoed louder than expected. Outside, cameras flashed again, but this time the narrative was no longer one-sided. Crowley exited through a side door, face tight, refusing questions. The investigation had not yet ended. The verdict had not yet been declared, but the smoke was thinning. And for the first time since the gunshots, the system appeared less certain of its own accusation. Evelyn stepped down the courthouse stairs under open sky, not free yet, not vindicated yet, but no longer alone against a sealed file. The trap had cracked. 3 days after the emergency investigation began, Willow Ridge witnessed something it had not seen in generations. power walking downward instead of upward. The morning was clear, almost deceptively gentle. A soft breeze moved through the town square, stirring flags that had hung stiffly during the previous week's tension. Residents gathered again in front of the courthouse, but this time the atmosphere felt different. It was not curiosity. It was anticipation edged with disbelief. State Bureau vehicles lined the curb. Derek Crowley was escorted out of the mayor's office by 2 state agents. He no longer wore the sharply tailored navy suits that once defined his public image. Instead, he stood in a wrinkled gray jacket, shoulders slightly rounded, his blonde hair unstyled for the first time since his campaign days. Without the stage, without the microphones he controlled, he appeared smaller, not physically diminished, but structurally unsupported. Beside him walked Agent Rebecca Alvarez, composed as ever, her dark eyes steady, posture firm. She did not grip him aggressively, but her presence communicated finality. The charges filed were extensive: corruption, abuse of authority, unlawful coercion under civic labor statutes, misappropriation of public funds, and orchestration of a staged, violent incident. Richard Hale had been detained earlier that morning at his apartment outside Savannah. Deputy Carl Simmons had been placed on administrative leave pending formal review. The structure that had seemed so immovable only days earlier now showed cracks too visible to ignore. Crowley did not speak as cameras flashed. In the courtroom, Judge Harold Whitman presided over the final public session related to Evelyn Carter's case. The benches were filled beyond capacity. Margaret Doyle sat near the aisle, notebook resting quietly on her knee. Noah Bennett stood along the back wall, observing without lifting his camera. This moment did not require amplification. Evelyn entered through the side door, no longer in holding attire but wearing her familiar charcoal coat. Her wrists were free. Henry walked beside her, one hand lightly resting at the small of her back. His arthritis had worsened over the week, but he stood straighter today. Buddy had remained home. Crowds were too much for his aging hips. Whitman adjusted his glasses before speaking. His voice carried calmly, without theatrical emphasis. After review of all evidence presented through independent investigation, this court finds no basis for charges against Mrs. Evelyn Carter. The accusations were unfounded, constructed upon manipulated information. He paused, allowing the weight of the words to settle. Mrs. Carter is not a criminal. She is a citizen whose voice should have been heard long before this courtroom became necessary. A quiet stillness filled the space. No cheering erupted. No triumphant cries. Just a collective exhale. Evelyn did not bow her head. She met Whitman's gaze steadily, acknowledging the ruling not as a favor, but as a correction. Later that afternoon in the town square, state officials organized a formal address to the community. It was a deliberate choice: public accountability for public harm. On the temporary platform stood State Commissioner Thomas Green, a tall black man in his early 50s with close-cropped hair and calm, resonant speech. Green had built his career advocating for ethical oversight in rural municipalities after witnessing systemic neglect in his own hometown years earlier. His expression held gravity, not distance. He addressed the crowd plainly. What occurred here was not simply misconduct by one individual. It was a failure of oversight. A system that does not question power allows power to corrode. He looked directly toward Evelyn as he continued. One corrupted element can weaken an entire structure if that structure sleeps. Willow Ridge will not sleep again. Behind him, Derek Crowley was required to deliver a formal apology before transfer to state custody. The statement had been drafted under legal supervision, stripped of deflection. Crowley's voice trembled slightly, not with remorse but with the shock of collapse. I apologize to the citizens of Willow Ridge for actions taken under my administration that caused harm and division. The words sounded hollow. Then, at the instruction of legal counsel, he lowered himself to his knees on the wooden platform. Gasps rippled through the crowd. It was not theatrical humiliation. It was procedural acknowledgement of accountability. He knelt not because he had chosen humility, but because he had exhausted authority. Evelyn watched quietly. She felt no satisfaction in the gesture, only confirmation. The applause that followed was slow, not loud, not explosive. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Each clap a declaration that silence would no longer protect injustice. Malik stood near the back of the square, hands folded, eyes reflecting something steadier than anger. Jonah leaned against a lamp-post, relief softening his habitual grin. Tessa stood beside Clara Jennings, one hand on her belly, the other clasped with Mrs. Jennings's weathered fingers. Lena watched from a slight distance, accompanied discreetly by a state-appointed protective liaison, Officer Dana Whitfield, a tall black woman in her 30s with close-cropped curls and alert eyes. Dana had once testified in a federal case against internal corruption within her own department, an experience that cost her promotions but preserved her integrity. She now oversaw witness safety during transitional proceedings. Lena's shoulders were no longer hunched. Fear had not vanished, but it no longer dictated her posture. In the days that followed, change unfolded gradually. Financial transparency reports were posted publicly. The Civic Improvement Labor Program was suspended pending restructuring. Independent review boards were proposed. Willow Ridge did not transform overnight, but it shifted. Noah Bennett received an offer from a larger Atlanta-based newspaper to join their investigative desk. The salary was tempting, the prestige undeniable. He considered it carefully, walking past Magnolia Street where road repairs had finally begun under interim leadership. Margaret Doyle found him staring at the fresh asphalt one morning. "You going to leave?" she asked without accusation. "Eventually," Noah replied, "but not yet." He chose to remain for another month, assisting in budget review coverage and hosting small workshops at the community center on media literacy and documentation, teaching residents how to track public spending records themselves. Meanwhile, Lena resumed her classes at the local college. Under guidance from Officer Whitfield and Agent Alvarez, she received formal witness protection counseling during the transition period. But she did not retreat into anonymity. Instead, she organized a weekly support circle at the church basement. She named it No Longer Silent. The group was modest at first, 5 women sitting on folding chairs in a circle beneath humming fluorescent lights. Tessa attended. So did Mrs. Jennings's niece. Conversations began cautiously but grew stronger with each meeting. On Cedar Street, Evelyn returned home that evening as the sun dipped low behind pecan trees. Henry was waiting on the porch, eyes reddened but smiling. Buddy barked, an uneven, enthusiastic sound, then trotted clumsily down the steps to greet her, tail wagging in wide, joyful arcs. His movements were stiff but determined. He circled her twice before pressing his head against her knee. Evelyn knelt carefully despite the ache in her joints and buried her fingers in his aging fur. The house smelled the same as it always had: soil, cedarwood, and quiet resilience. Later that afternoon, she stepped into her backyard garden. The rows had gone unattended during the chaos. Weeds had begun reclaiming edges. She rolled up her sleeves slowly and pressed her hands into the earth. The soil was cool and forgiving. She did not plant out of forgetfulness, she planted out of reclamation. Peace, she understood, was not a gift bestowed by leadership. It was maintained by vigilance. Henry joined her, handing her small seedlings he had started indoors during the week. Together, without ceremony, they rebuilt the row. From the porch, Buddy watched, tail thumping softly against the wood. Willow Ridge remained imperfect. Oversight committees still had work to do. Trust would rebuild slowly, but something fundamental had shifted. Silence no longer defined safety. And this time, peace was not granted, it was guarded. This story is not only about a courtroom, a corrupt mayor, or an elderly woman in handcuffs. It is about something we face every day in quieter forms. Evelyn Carter did not fight with violence. She fought with awareness. She paid attention when others looked away. She asked questions when silence felt safer. She reminded us that injustice rarely begins with explosions. It begins with small compromises, a fee that seems unfair but is ignored, a rumor that feels wrong but is not challenged, a neighbor mistreated while others stay silent. In daily life, we may not face a corrupt mayor, but we face moments that test our character. Do we speak when someone is treated unfairly at work? Do we defend a child being bullied? Do we question information before sharing it? Do we treat people of different races and backgrounds with dignity instead of suspicion? This story teaches that peace is not the absence of conflict. Peace is the presence of courage. Real courage is not loud. It is steady. It is patient. It gathers facts. It builds community. It refuses to let fear decide the future. There is also an educational lesson here about systems and responsibility. Power without accountability becomes dangerous. Communities must stay informed. Transparency matters, documentation matters, media literacy matters. If we do not understand how decisions are made, we cannot protect ourselves from being misled. At the same time, we must guard our hearts. Bitterness can grow just as quickly as corruption. Evelyn did not seek revenge. She sought truth. She did not humiliate her enemy. She planted her garden. That is strength. Choosing to rebuild instead of destroy is strength. In our own lives, we can start small. Listen more carefully. Verify before judging. Stand beside those who feel alone. Teach our children fairness and courage. Pray for wisdom before reacting. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs encouragement. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Your voice matters more than you think. If you believe that ordinary people can protect their communities through integrity, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more stories that remind us who we are meant to be. And may God bless you and your family. May He give you discernment when confusion surrounds you, courage when fear pressures you, and peace when storms pass through your life. If you believe that truth will always rise, even when it is buried, comment Amen below.